Today, I'm meeting with Dennis Tucker, and I'm looking forward to this because Dennis is a Utah custody evaluator, and we're going to have a refreshing and candid discussion about custody evaluations. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that is. But before we take another second in this interview, Dennis, would you please introduce yourselves to those that are listening or watching so that if after this interview they'd like to talk to you more or retain you in your services, they'll know how to reach you?
Well, thank you, Eric. My name is Dennis Tucker. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I'm an evaluator for New Beginnings Evaluations. And the contact information, my phone number is 801-979-0610. Our email is new.evals@gmail.com. Our website is nbeval.com.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being so concise. Everybody, now you have his name, his number, his email, and you can go to their website if you'd like to take a look at that. So we're going to talk about custody evaluations, which, as I've told Dennis before we had this interview scheduled, is like, you know what? I, as a practicing divorce and family lawyer, I've soured on custody evaluations. I've taken a very clear position that I find them to be more often than not, in fact, quite often, usually would be I wouldn't be overstating the subject. I find them to be just a waste of time, effort, and money. And before we talk to Dennis about this, and he already knows what I've said, but I'm going to tell you, the viewer or the listener, why that is. We will then, in the course of talking to Dennis, find out how a custody evaluation is designed to work, and then he and I will go back and forth and talk a little bit about what's good and what's bad about this process the way Utah does it. I don't like custody evaluations generally because I find them to take far too long given the subject matter and the value of the product that you get at the end. And by the way, and if anyone's wondering, that's not like I have a problem with Dennis's, the way he does custody evaluations. I don't. I'm saying all custody evaluators, and Dennis is no exception. Not because I don't like Dennis. Dennis and I get along fine. It's just that this is why I'm so glad that Dennis and I are meeting, is because he's willing to have a conversation that most custody evaluators wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. And that's not because Dennis is a fool. It's because Dennis is confident enough to be able to talk about the limitations. And I'll leave that to him, but as to what those are. But I'm just saying, I find it to be way too expensive, way too long, given the quality of the work product. And I've also found that the work product is extremely subjective. And so a lot of these custody evaluators, when you ask them and say, hey, you don't really know what will happen if the court follows your advice or your recommendations, do you? And a lot of evaluators, not all, but the majority I've dealt with, get very defensive. And they're like, well, how dare you? When you say I don't know, that sounds like you're questioning my competence or my expertise. And I say, no. I'm just asking you. I mean, you could be one of the greatest experts, but nonetheless, you don't know the future. Nobody does. Isn't that correct, sir or madam? And they're like, oh, well, again, you make it look like I'm a fool. I've worked hard. I went to Harvard or something like that. It's like, that's great. And you've written some very interesting articles and you've done some good work, but you don't know what's really going on here. You don't really know what's going to happen in the future. You may make a suggestion that could work, fail, or even make things worse, and they don't like to talk about it. I've also found that a lot of what goes on in a lot of custody evaluations is just flat out pseudoscientific. And I'll give Dennis some examples. He has not heard about this yet. I've had a custody evaluator that wanted to use polygraph examinations, claiming that they were a common and accepted tool of the custody evaluation process, which to my knowledge is not true. I've been in situations, yeah, and then they some of them are very heavy on psychological testing when there's no allegations of any kind of, or even indications that there are psychological, mental health, or emotional health problems. So what happens is, and this is when I'll turn it over to Dennis, you end up spending thousands, in some cases tens of thousands of dollars. You can take at least, if you're lucky, 3 months to get one done, oftentimes at least 2 or 3 times that amount of time to get it done. And then you get kind of a milquetoast report either in the form of testimony from the evaluator in a deposition or in the form of a written report. For some reason in Utah, you can't do both unless you get special approval from the court or the permission of the opposing party and the evaluator. You get this thing, and so it can be a great deal of time and expense, and then you get this report, and then everybody kind of goes, huh, we did all that for this? Well, I could have told you that, and I'm not even, the neighbor across the street could have, done 80% of that. So telling you, yeah, those were my observations as well. Those are my critiques and my problems that I have with custody evaluations. So Dennis, tell me where I am right, where I'm wrong, where I may have overstated or even understated my critiques. And then, of course, your 2 cents worth, regardless of whether it's a topic I've already covered.
Well, Eric, your vantage point is different than mine. I'm a therapist, and I see war and conflict oftentimes between parties. I see horrible things that take place between couples that used to love each other. I see what I consider to be bullying and intimidation. I see parents that have withheld a child from another just because they didn't like them. I have seen the legal system call a man a felon when ultimately all he did was disagree with his wife on email. And so I've seen certain things, but ultimately what I'm seeing is that there is a need for a final word. And the rule of law, which is provided by our court systems, ultimately does provide a final word. And the providing of that clear boundary is ultimately the principal benefit of a custody evaluation. However, in practice, that final word oftentimes is challenged. High conflict cases can take place where they are in courts for years. And this is also notorious, even in the professional world. We talk about these and we call them, quote, high conflict cases, because there is no resolution. They don't accept the final word.
Yeah.
They use law as a bludgeon to bash the other person and ultimately to financially exhaust the other party, and in that way win by default.
So that's a good point, is that some people will say, I wanted a custody evaluation and I don't care what the outcome is. I just wanted to spend a lot of time, poison a lot of people's opinions, and do a lot of damage. And if it turns out that I win the custody, however you define win the custody award, great. But even if I lose, that's okay. That's just, I will live to fight another day. If I wasn't able to turn the children against a good parent, well, all right, I'll just spend the next couple of years doing that. And I'll work on alienating them. I'll work on trumping up false charges and all that sort of thing. That's a very good point. And I really like what you had to say, regardless of my position on custody evaluations myself, about how you're saying the hope and the purpose of and correct me if I've misstated this, the hope and the purpose of a custody evaluation is to, and I think we talked about this before we started the recording, is to get as much data, as much relevant data as can be gathered from different sources and different ways of collecting the data, so that we can then, as I've heard someone else say, we collect as many of the dots as we can, so then we can connect the dots. And the more we have, just like when you were a little kid, if you had a simple dot drawing that was only 10 dots, it looked kind of like a stop sign. But if it had 100, then you'd get an actual face, something like that, because you had more dots to connect.
Correct.
That's a good thing, because then the court says everybody wants to make a final decision. And the more that we believe we have to give us a clear picture of what we need to do going forward, the better a plan we can formulate. And everybody, even myself, would acknowledge that the best laid plans are still, they don't survive first contact with the enemy, and nobody can predict the future, which is why whenever you hear about somebody promising great returns in the market, they say past performance is no guarantee of future performance. So I like what you said there. So this is the thing that I think that courts, lawyers, and especially parents get hypnotized by, is because because they're in a very stressful and anxious position, when they hear what the goal of a custody evaluation is, all they hear is what the intention is and equate that with the result. And they fail to recognize, because they've never been through this before, and because you've often got people selling them on it saying, hey, this is great, we're going to evaluate, we're going to get all this data, and we will know what needs to be done. And it will be fair. Another thing that Dennis and I talked about before we started the recording was, if people are interested in getting to the truth and resolving disputes, then the legal process, including the custody evaluation process, can work quite well. It's not perfect, but everybody understands that, and they're all working together in a singular goal. And that's trying to say we want to get to as much truth as we can, as much understanding as we can, to make the best decision. But all it takes is one person to try to throw a spanner in the works, and it can have just the opposite effect. We can get farther from the truth. We can be confused. We can be deceived. So, Dennis, my next question for you is, where do you see custody evaluations and custody evaluators doing the courts and the parents and children a truly valuable service? And where do they oversell, overstate, or underserve the purpose of a custody evaluation?
Eric, the purpose of a custody evaluation is to provide a clear path. And for example, the default hope of the Utah courts is joint custody. Typically, that means joint physical custody, joint legal custody. And so it wants to provide a path in a custody evaluation. Ultimately, the recommendations that are provided are to help provide that path. If a parent is deficient and not able to provide necessary essential care for the child, and they have the capacity to do so, then in theory, the custody evaluation should provide recommendations that would allow that parent to take care of those problems for the eventual goal of getting back to joint custody. And that might take some years, it might take some efforts, but oftentimes people use it to declare victory. They want to eliminate the other parent. They want to have it all to themselves. Sometimes in the case of moving, where one parent is moving across the country or a significant distance, then
in other words, a long enough distance that joint physical custody is not going to work, or are going to be more trouble to the kids than it's worth. Okay.
Correct. So in the cases of moving significant distances, or the case of significant abuse, they want evidence to support that it's not in the best interest of the child to have one parent or joint custody. And the custody evaluators to help provide evidence to support at some point a claim. So
let's talk about some of the typical, if we've got two parents that don't want to harm each other in the custody determination, and they don't want the kids to suffer, they probably won't need a custody evaluation. You could see a situation where they might, but generally those are two parents that can work things out, because even if they make what ultimately turns out to be a bad plan that doesn't work for the kids, or is too hard on one or both of the parents, they're willing to go back to the drawing board and tweak it until it works the way they wanted it to, or as best it can. Agreed?
Agreed. I currently have a custody evaluation on hold because the father brought up the idea that he made a proposal to the mother, and if she agrees, then they won't need a custody evaluation.
Because they can work it out themselves. And that doesn't mean that they perfected it. It just means that they're saying, we have a shared goal. And
Correct.
So we will work with each. We know what we want to get. We know what it is we want to get, and we'll do what it takes to get there. So the people that usually engage in custody evaluations are when it's a zero-sum game like you're talking about, like, no, all custody for me, or I want to exercise a certain degree of control, or I want to make sure that you don't, or the kids don't get to do certain things. Let's talk about, and I just realized this is a question I hadn't planned to ask, but I think that you're going to want to address this. What are the ways you see people trying to deceive custody evaluators or hijack the custody evaluation process for ill-gotten gains?
In a custody evaluation, it's typically anticipated that the parties will put on a positive show. And in fact, in the forensic testing, when populations for custody evaluations are measured, that all typically they fake good. So in other words, it's somewhat expected. Judgment is happening, and so it is understood. So we use it as data points, and this is why data points are so essential, because data points aren't just what happens when you sit down in the custody evaluator's office. Data points are the things that have happened in the past.
When you didn't think anyone was going to observe this or take note of it. So you're more likely to behave honestly.
Yes, your true self, what seems to be going on, things collected over time, which, by the way, sometimes a custody evaluation is anticipated, and maybe even years in advance, someone might start collecting data for that reason.
And do you feel like a competent custody evaluator is able to suss that out and say, I see machinations here. I see somebody trying to game this system. And it's like, I'm impressed that they would spend months or years laying these foundations, but nevertheless, this is somebody trying to game the system. Is it fairly transparent? Is that fairly easy to detect, even though they think that they're criminal masterminds when they're doing it?
Well, now you're talking to some extent about the opinion of whichever expert happens to be consulted.
Fair
And
enough.
believe it or not, the experts can and do disagree, like judges can and do disagree, like parents can and do disagree. And so if we're looking for absolute truth, which I do believe is the goal of the whole legal profession, it's oftentimes a theory as opposed to a reality in practice.
What are some of the, if they exist, what are some of the go-to tricks that a lot of parents think are going to give them an advantage? Whether they are malicious or when they say, well, no, I'm being sincere, but I think I'm justified in doing this. You've already talked about people that present an untrue positive view of themselves, where they go out of their way to look better than they really are. But let me just, let me make sure I'm making myself clear. Let's start with, how about good old physical abuse claims? Let's assume that you don't know this as the evaluator, but I know as one of the parents, it's like, I know that my spouse is not abusive, but I think that I can either spend months or years framing my spouse, or I just figured it's like, well, I'll just start right now. I'll just say the kids are too young to talk, so I'll say that my spouse abuses them, and just see if the evaluator will believe me, because I'll turn on the tears and I'll get my mom to back me up, and maybe I'll even, if I'm pretty technically savvy, I'll falsify a few text messages. Does that work?
We strive to use multiple data points, and allegations of abuse do happen. We look for things such as substantiating reports from DCFS or preponderance of such reports. However, when there's 141 pages of DCFS reports, and most of them or all of them have been unsubstantiated, it starts to look a bit like things are being twisted and fabricated. And so oftentimes it becomes a attempt to find out what the best interest of the child is. Oftentimes, as an evaluator, I find that children are used as part of the warfare. The battle is for their mind, and that can be extremely difficult. And so,
Let me ask you this. Oh, go ahead.
as much as possible, we want to help eliminate the alienation that oftentimes can take place. And so there might be different philosophies and theories on how to do that by the different custody evaluators.
If parental alienation is happening, is it pretty objectively provable? Can we say, look at these behaviors, look at these words of this child? This is a child who didn't really feel this way. This is a child who is saying I'm scared or I hate or whatever, but isn't in that position. This is a child who's been convinced by an alienating parent. Is that fairly easy to prove, or is it fairly easy to dupe an evaluator?
Eric, this is often a hot topic in courts across the country.
I agree.
So hot that they no longer like the word parental alienation. That word now has been essentially rejected, and now they have essentially a similar word, but now they call it gatekeeping, restrictive gatekeeping.
True.
And so, in other words, these are battles. There are experts that can be called on both sides, both with scientific backing to support them, both with credible scientific journal reports. And so this is part of the struggle that happens. And so it is hard to find the truth, but typically an evaluator is able to get a sense of a lot of this. And ultimately, after they weigh all this information, they really do want what is in the best interest of the child. However, parents will disagree, lawyers will disagree, and ultimately, possibly even the judge will disagree. Now, I have, to show you the difficulty of this, I was involved in a case with a fairly renowned psychologist who had declared a mother to be principally involved in parental alienation. And what was interesting about the situation is that it seemed quite obvious to the judge that the evaluator was making an incorrect call, and spent a significant amount of time doing his own research into the matter and found against the evaluator. And as a result, a second evaluation was requested, and that's where I got involved, and I had a chance to look at things. And this psychologist, who frankly is quite famous in our area, he did see things through the data that he was given. He used an abundance of professional literature, and still, in my estimation, he did get it wrong. And I did agree with the judge in what his ruling was. And ultimately, she was not a party to parental alienation. And in fact, it was the other way around. And so it's a difficult thing. These things can be very challenging. Experts can and do get it wrong. And ultimately, would you rather decide this matter with your ex, or would you like to leave it to the courts to decide the matter? Is it better that the two of you work things out, or would you like some strangers who you don't know, but do use expert opinion and do use preponderance of evidence and do make their best opinion? That is what a custody evaluation does. The reason I've debated these same questions that you have, my conclusion is I believe I can do a world of good by clarifying the parameters of the battle and giving a reason why the battle should be concluded, and a list of recommendations that can aid both parents in helping to eliminate the battle on a longer term basis.
And you make a good point. You can make recommendations, but rarely will you say, I find that mom is unfit or dad is unfit or dad is engaging in gatekeeping or alienating behavior. You may find evidence of that, but you don't really decide those things for the court. You just simply say, this could be interpreted as, or this seems to suggest that, and on that basis, or these bases, I make my recommendations. Would that be accurate?
That is correct.
Would it be true to state, going back to our opening statement here, that there are some evaluators that feel uncomfortable admitting that their expert opinion is just that, an opinion, not a scientific fact, that there may be scientific bases, there may be studies, there may be facts, there may be data they base it upon, but they're saying ultimately I may misread or put too much emphasis on something, and so I could get it right, meaning that I analyze the situation in such a way that my recommendation, if followed, turned out to, at least it seemed to work. Or look, I could give you a recommendation that everyone would say was competently done and may end up just being a complete disaster through no fault of my own. Because I mean, how many evaluators do you feel are comfortable enough saying that if you believe that would be a true statement?
Eric, an artist is as good as his or her tools. An evaluator is as good as the data points presented before them. And frankly, sometimes the dots of the data points suggest certain things, and the evaluator must follow those dots. Can the dots be wrong? Yes. Can they be outdated? Yes. Can they have some political reasons for presenting the dots that they have? Yes. So it's a science, yes, but it's also an art. And as much as possible, I think the professional world is trying to make it otherwise. But sometimes in the greater attempt at that, things become more muddied and less clear.
I appreciate the candid discussion you've had with me, and I appreciate the fact that you're not so easily persuaded by some of the critiques I've made, and that you have your own opinions. And I think that speaks well of you as an expert, frankly, when you're being called upon to ask or to give an opinion, and you're saying, look, I will admit that I don't know everything, but what I do know, I'm not going to make any apologies for. I think that helps to engender confidence in any expert witness, but it also shows us it's like these expert witnesses are not prophets. They can't tell you, it's like, do this, and I know that this will happen. I can tell you that it odds are that will be the case based upon what we know and what the status of the science is currently. And that could change as we learn more or whatever it is, but this is better than what you're basically saying is, in the absence of what we've produced for the court, you'd be even less certain or less able to make a more informed decision. Would that be accurate?
Eric, it's better than drawing pistols and shooting each other. And therefore, data points, an expert that has been accepted by both parties and the courts, and their recommendations based upon those data points, I do believe that it's a better use, and it can provide important clarification of boundaries that otherwise wouldn't exist.
Let me ask you this, though, because as I said, I find custody evaluations more trouble than they're worth in most cases. Do you ever see custody evaluation? And again, I'm not trying to get the answer I want from you. It may even feel like that. It may, to those watching or listening, it may sound like that. But have you ever, like you talked about that one where you were brought in by, after one evaluator was of a position that was different from yours, and I would say almost diametrically opposed. It seems to me that there's oftentimes in these custody evaluations, a lot of opinion based on very little data, where I see a lot of evaluators who kind of let their imaginations run away with them. Or another example would be when confronted with sticky, thorny subjects like allegations of sexual abuse and molestation, the evaluators are like going, well, gee, I don't want to get this wrong. Or how about physical abuse too? It's like, gee, I don't want to have my name in the papers because I said that I think that mom or dad is a fit parent, and then based on my recommendations, the court does this or that, and then this child winds up in the morgue. And it's like, oh, well, you thought that mom was perfectly safe, and then she slit the child's throat 2 months later, or something like that. You ever see people? I'll just be very candid with you. I see evaluators, if a parent makes enough allegations of sexual or physical or even psychological abuse, I've seen evaluators that, in my opinion, have said, I don't want to look like I'm getting this wrong, so I will err on the side of caution against the accused parent, even if there's scant or little or equivocal evidence. I don't want to get this wrong, so I will simply recommend against this parent so that nobody can blame me if anything bad happens. You see that happening?
I have seen in various reports where the evidences presented aren't necessarily supported in the conclusions, and sometimes the conclusions or the findings may actually go against evidence presented in the very report that they're using. So
is that the result of just careless or sloppy evaluation, or can that happen to the best of the experts?
I believe at some point that they follow a trail, but that the trail can get lost, and that they can follow a certain aspect of a trail because of things that may have happened in their own past. We can't separate the human from his or her perception, and we can't distance some of the things, the traumas, the experiences that the individual has had that help form the opinion of that particular individual. We can't remove the human element from the search for justice.
That is a perfect place to end, because I couldn't agree more with you on that, is that these are decisions that are being placed in the hands of fallible human beings who are going to subjectively analyze the evidence and then have to try their best when the system is working properly. People trying their best to make their best judgments who are fallible, and despite their best efforts might still make a mistake. I appreciate that. Well, Dennis, thank you so much for the time. And for those that would like to talk to you more, or perhaps utilize your services for a custody evaluation, would you give us your contact information once more?
My phone number is 801-979-0610. My email is new.evals, EVALS, @gmail.com.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity, Eric. Take care.